One of the amazing things about behavior is just how complicated it can get. So human beings especially are able to do very, very complicated, very, very intricate, very, very amazing behaviors. And oftentimes these behaviors are the result of chaining together much simpler behaviors into a very complicated sequence known as a behavior chain. But how can you make these behavior chains and increase their performance as much as possible? Well, that's what we're going to be taking a look at today, because I'm Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is behavior modification. Let's go. All right, so today we're going to talk about behavior chains, and we're going to talk about the factors that affect the performance of a behavior chain. But before we get to that, we got to define what a behavior chain actually is. And for this, we are going to go to Cooper, Heron, and Heward, and their definition of what a behavior chain is. And a behavior chain is a linked sequence of responses leading to a terminal outcome. Each response produces a stimulus change that functions as a conditioned reinforcement for the response as a discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain. To actually go on with a little bit more important information, reinforcement of the last response in a chain maintains the reinforcing effectiveness of the stimulus changes produced by all previous responses in the chain. So if you're taking a look at this definition here and you are saying what to any part of it, one thing that you should do is get a foundation for what behavior chains are before we take a look at the factors that affect the performance of behavior chains. And for that, we have a few videos available, so you can go check out an introduction to behavior chains for just the basics of what a behavior chain actually is. And then you can also take a look at this video here, how to train a behavior chain in terms of the techniques that you can use, such as forward chaining, backward chaining, all those techniques in order to effectively teach a behavior chain. So all of that is available, but what we're going to do is, even though you might have that foundation, we are going to simplify this definition. So we are going to go from this down to this, and we're just going to focus in on that first aspect of this definition. So a behavior chain is a A behavior chain is a linked sequence of responses leading to a terminal outcome. So using this working definition of what a behavior chain is, basically it's any behavior that you need to do in sequence that leads to some outcome that is your goal. So for example, you can think of something like opening a door. Opening a door is a behavior chain because there's a linked sequence of responses that are required, right? So first you walk up to the door, and then you grab the handle, and then you pull, and then you walk through that open door holding your friend's hand, right? That behavior chain needs to be done in sequence. If you try to walk through the door before you open the door, right? If you do that out of sequence, you walk up to the door, you grab the handle, you try to walk through, and then you try to open it, you're going to have a bad time and you're going to have an unsuccessful performance of that behavior. So a behavior chain is that linked sequence of behaviors that leads to a terminal outcome, your terminal goal, and they have to be done in sequence. And there's a few ways to train these, but we're going to focus instead on the 5 factors that affect the performance of these behavior chains. All right, so factor number 1. So the first factor that affects the performance of a behavior chain is the completeness of the task analysis. And again, if you are wondering, well, what's a task analysis? Previous videos, go check them out. This one will make a lot more sense if you do. So the completeness of the task analysis means that you need to make sure that your task analysis is well structured and that any incorrect sequencing of the sub behaviors or any missing discriminative stimuli are not missing. Basically, you have to make sure that the sequence is correct and the discriminative stimuli are present. Otherwise, it's going to make learning the chain very, very difficult. So let's give you a scenario. Let's say that you're a psychology student and you're learning how to conduct a literature review. So you have a senior research project, you got to do that literature review, and your professor gives you a step-by-step guide, right? So this is a task analysis for a literature review. They give you the step-by-step sequence of what you need to do. But let's say that that sequence is incomplete. And let's say that they don't actually include in that sequence how to access the database through your university, for example. Well, you are going to have a very, very difficult time completing that behavior chain if one of the sequences is actually missing. So what needs to be done is the task analysis needs to be redone to include that missing sequence, learning how to access the databases, and then you can learn that sequence and correctly perform that behavior chain. So things to consider are things like making sure that you plan before training. So spend time on the task analysis to refine it and make sure that all the behaviors are there and the discriminative stimuli are there as well. And then you need to be flexible as well, because adjustments might need to be done, including more prompts for the difficult steps, greater assistance basically during the difficult steps. So you need to be flexible in terms of how you approach the behavior chain. All right, number 2. So the second factor of forming the performance of a behavior chain, and this one makes intuitive sense, is just the length or complexity of the chain. Longer or more complex chains, they're going to take more time to learn. Multiple chain clusters linked together. So if you have multiple chains that you then try to chain together, that's also going to increase your training duration. So those factors, the length or the complexity of the chain, basically adds to the duration of the performance of the chain and the learning of the chain. So let's give you another scenario. We're going to stay with universities for this video here. So let's say that you are learning how to conduct an experiment in your advanced lab psychology class. So a psychology experiment includes many steps in a linked sequence. So you need to design your study. You need to obtain IRB approval. You need to recruit participants. You need to collect data. You need to analyze results. You need to write a report. And each one of those steps in the chain have their own linked sequence of behaviors in a behavior chain. So these are multiple chain clusters all linked together. Each step builds on the previous one. So that's what makes it a chain. But if you just tell somebody, oh, hey, go do this chain, go do an experiment, they'll look exactly like this individual here, and they will be frustrated, they will be overwhelmed, and they'll be unable to perform the chain. What a good professor will do is they'll break that chain into smaller segments, and they'll say, all right, let's forget about everything else, and we are going to focus on designing a study. And let's take that first step of designing a study, coming up with a research topic, and let's break that down into smaller steps as well. And then basically take it bit by bit, master one phase before moving on to the next. So you need to take this into account. What is the length or the complexity of your chain? Is it too much to tackle? Do we need to break it up into smaller chains and learn those sequences first? All right, number 3, the schedule of reinforcement. So what schedule of reinforcement are you going to choose, and how are you going to choose it for each section of the behavior chain? So reinforcement affects all the responses in a behavior chain, but it does not affect them equally. So in backward chaining, for example, where you start with the last step and learn that first, the final response in the chain is strengthened faster. That last step is strengthened faster because that's when you receive the reinforcement more frequently. If you're doing forward chaining, the opposite is true. That first step is reinforced more because it's going to receive reinforcement more frequently. So choosing which one to use sometimes can be done by deciding which part of the chain might need more reinforcement. So for example, if you're trying to learn how to analyze data using a statistical package like SPSS, your professor might determine, well, you know what? The final step, that step of interpreting the output correctly, that's actually the most critical step. That's actually the most difficult step. So if that's the case, you would want to start with backward chaining and teach that part of the chain first. So give the student the output to SPSS. Don't teach them how to use the program. Just give them the output and say, let's work on understanding the output to SPSS. And then you would move it back one step in terms of how to create that output. And then you would move it back one step in terms of how to choose a test. And then you would move it back one step in terms of how to enter data into SPSS. Basically, you identify that maybe interpretation is the most difficult portion of doing SPSS. So therefore, we're going to do backward chaining so that gets reinforced the most. So use an appropriate reinforcement schedule to maintain the chain. And again, the number of responses in the chain may impact your reinforcement strategy in terms of whether you start at the back or whether you start at the front. All right, step 4. So step 4 is the factor of stimulus variation. And this is the idea that if you're trying to learn a behavior chain, you need to be able to deal with stimulus variation. So you need to encounter all possible variations of those discriminative stimuli, those links in the chain, the parts that link one part of the chain to the next part. Those discriminative stimuli, they can come in different variations. And you should learn all those possible variations to produce an effective chain and to improve your generalization of your skills throughout the real world aspects of that chain. So let's give you an example again. Let's say that you're learning how to present your research. So learning how to present research, one of the discriminative stimuli in there is what type of media are you presenting in? Are you using PowerPoint? Are you doing a research poster? Are you doing class presentations? So you can learn how to do the basics of a presentation. And then that last step is creating the PowerPoint slide and using the PowerPoint slides. However, you will not then be able to generalize to something like using a whiteboard. So just because you know how to use a PowerPoint slide doesn't mean that you know how to use a whiteboard when you're doing your presentations. So if you're asked to learn the behavior chain of giving presentations, then what you need to do is you need to encounter all possible variations of that discriminative stimulus, i.e., you're going to be using PowerPoint this time, you're going to be using a whiteboard the next time, you're going to be using those flip paper presentation things, easels at another time. You need to practice with those different presentation formats so that when you create your presentation, you reach that level of the chain, you finish that level of the chain, and then all of a sudden it reveals the discriminative stimulus of, oh, you're going to be using a whiteboard. It doesn't throw your behavior off. You have experience with that discriminative stimulus, and then you can then use the whiteboard or use PowerPoint or use any other format. All right, and then the last one that we need for the chain is actually response variation. So sometimes you have a stimulus variation where different discriminative stimuli are going to indicate different types of behaviors are needed, but you can also get response variations where you need to change your responses in order to achieve the particular outcome. So let's say that you are doing your research project and your research project requires that you interview business people on a certain question that you're working on for your research project. Okay, so you need to interview business people. So an interview, again, is a complex behavior chain, and you can learn aspects of it. So you learn how to conduct these interviews for that qualitative research study. And in some cases, you might record using a laptop. But in other cases, you might need to take handwritten notes. So that is an example of that stimulus variation that we talked about before, right? Because that discriminative stimulus, you know how to do an interview, and sometimes you're going to do it in a laptop, sometimes you're going to do it by writing a report. However, sometimes the responses that you receive are actually going to be different. So you need to be able to, for example, adjust your questioning techniques based on whether or not the participant is reserved or talkative. You need to modify your approach for the given situation. Is the interviewer opening up? Are they not opening up? Are they giving you, yes or no answers to your questions? Are they going off way too long on certain questions? So you need to be able to change your technique based on the response variation that you encounter. So when you're training these your interview skills, you should anticipate modifying these responses that you give when introduced to these new variations in the stimulus that you're receiving. All right, so those were the factors affecting those complex behavior chains that we can string together small little steps that when you put them together lead to very, very complex behaviors. And by understanding these factors, you can design more effective behavior chains, leading to improved learning, leading to faster learning, leading to better generalization, and basically leading to more productive behavior overall. So one of the reasons or one of the ways that you can see this behavior chain analysis in effect is in this presentation, we decided to focus in on just the first part of the definition of a behavior chain by Cooper, Heron, and Heward. And now that we've learned a little bit more about behavior chains, and maybe you've watched those other videos, now you're actually probably ready for this huge definition here. And again, build it up piece by piece. Make sure that you don't skip sequences, and make sure that you observe these 5 factors, or think about these 5 factors that can affect a behavior chain to improve the learning and the outcome and the performance of these behavior chains. All right. So what we did today, again, we'll run that quote one more time. We defined what a behavior chain is, and then we took a look at the factors that affect the performance of these behavior chains, such as the completeness of the task analysis, the length or complexity of the chain, the schedules of reinforcement, the stimulus variation, and then the response variation. So that is it for what I wanted to cover today. Next time, we are going to get back on track, and we are going to take a look at shaping. Basically, how do you take baby steps to get to your goal? So how did I take little baby steps to get through this entire presentation? That's actually not shaping, but we will see why next time. But until then, stay frosty, stay functional, go modify some behavior. And we basically, all right, let's start that again. I got a behavior chain, my own presentation today. And what we're going to take a look at today are those 5 factors that affect the behavior of behavior chains, not the behavior of behavior chains, are made up of multiple behaviors strung together in a what is known as a, oh my goodness, this is going to be a challenging one. Okay, we can do this.
His struggle is man's struggle.